Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest aliens and UFOs encounters video. Well, I thought I would mix this one in here mainly because the situation involving this encounter is almost a great variation of sorts. This occurred to a young child at that time, and in their case, instead of encountering a UFO, it seems like they encountered more of a mini UFO, almost like it was a part or an orb of a UFO. More on that here in a minute, but as always, these entries come from the reddit.com website. They're from the subreddit called The Truth Is Here, and in this case, it comes from a user called the Audacious Boo, but the name there is very subtly titled as Xmas 88. Gives you an idea essentially of when this occurred. So let's go ahead and let's share this very unique encounter here, very detailed too, and then of course I'll give my thoughts on it afterward. So here's essentially what they stated. I was 9, it was Christmas Eve 1988, and my family's Christmas Eve party was winding down. My grandma was digging through the remnants of boxes, bows, and wrapping papers from our family's white elephant gift exchange to see what she could salvage for next year, and my mother and aunt were laughing and trading stories of holidays past. My two older half-sisters, Sherry and Penny, who were adults at the time, being 18 and 20 years older than me, were picking over the leftovers on the dining room table. I was sitting near the back of the Christmas tree where 3 gifts with my name on them remained. These were from my mom and grandma, as it was tradition that I could only open 1 gift before bedtime on Christmas Eve. The rest I had to wait to open with my other Santa gifts on Christmas morning. And so I assessed the 3 packages for some time before making my selection. It was nearing midnight. I had to be in bed soon. So decided to just pick the biggest one because it had weight and didn't sound like clothes when I shook it. And so when my mom said it was time, I eagerly unwrapped the gift. At my grandma's unspoken request, I was careful not to rip the paper or mess up the bow and set them aside as my gift was revealed. It was a telescope. It wasn't a high-quality counted the rings of Saturn type telescope. Rather, it was small, mostly made of plastic, and it still had the $14.99 price sticker on the box. I was gracious though, even though I wasn't impressed, though not because of the quality. I just didn't know the difference between a nice telescope and a cheap toy one because I simply had no interest in its function. And even if I was interested in what it did, the simple assembly required to make it work exceeded the grasp of my exceptionally short attention span. Now, my sister Sherry is the oldest, and to me back then, she was like a bossy hall monitor. She had no real authority, but that didn't stop her from trying to run everything. I'm 41 now, and she is 61, and seriously, not much has changed in that aspect. My other sister Penny is just 2 years younger than Sherry, so she would have been 29 at the time. She was different. A combination of unattended schizophrenia and drug abuse made her the wild card, meaning you never knew what you were going to get with her. On this night, she had managed to maintain a level of normalcy and a jovial mood, though under any circumstance at that time and regardless of her behavior, her personality seemed more comparable to mine rather than to any of the adults in the room. So Penny took an enthusiastic interest in my new gift and asked if we could go out back and test it out. I agreed, knowing that my compliance would afford me a bit more time before I had to go to bed, and being a child on the night before Christmas, I was naturally restless. And so Penny and I ascended onto the back porch, and in no time at all, my sister had the telescope assembled and in position for celestial exploration. It took her a bit longer to find a point of focus and adjust all the little knobs for optimal viewing. So while she was occupied by that, but my attention was drawn to the icicles that had formed on the awning and the dog's water bowl that had turned to solid ice. Being a Texan, this isn't generally common even for December, though it isn't generally uncommon either. Our winters are short, and much like my eccentric sister, you never know what you're going to get when it arrives. I feel the need to preface this next part of the story with 2 very important points. First, I need to say that my memory of this incident However perplexing it is, it's clear and vivid to me now as the very night it occurred. So this is a true and accurate account. Secondly, this entire event lasted no more than a minute, and while I must describe these events in succession, many of them occurred all at once. I had just taken off my mittens so I could utilize the full function of my hands and fingers for grasping when I heard Penny exclaim in amusement, "Whoa, cool." And so still having no interest at all in stargazing and far more focused on trying to retrieve a perfect icicle from the awning just using a garden hoe, I didn't even look up from what I was doing, figuring she had managed to find something bright to look at, and that just meant I had a bit more time to spend on trying to dislodge this big, beautiful icicle before it melted. Then it occurred to me that the icicle was definitely melting, and quite rapidly too, when just moments before it was still on the process of forming. Now its dripping was like a leaky faucet, and what was even stranger was that all this water was dripping around me, and yet it made no sound. In fact, nothing made a sound, not the water or the wind or the highway in the distance. Not even my sister tinkering with that telescope. And then the dripping slowed. And I don't mean that in the sense that there was more time within each drop, but rather the droplets were now taking longer to fall to the ground. And so confused, I immediately looked over at my sister and found her standing upright, not bent over, peering into this telescope, but staring out into the yard. And so I turned my gaze to match hers, and what I saw completely eluded the grasp of my 9-year-old comprehension. Hovering a mere 4 feet above my backyard fence was an almond-shaped capsule about the size of a pontoon boat. It was metallic color, almost like chrome, with no discernible crevasses, no windows, no doors. It was completely flush, and even though it had no fixtures for light to shine from, the area around it was completely illuminated as light reflected off on millions of water droplets now suspended in midair. I was struck with fear and confusion as I broke my gaze just long enough to look over at my sister, searching for some sort of sign as to what this thing was and if we were in any sort of danger. Now Penny looked over at me, grinning from ear to ear, saying, "Cindy Boo, it's a UFO." And now the curious thing was I didn't hear her say it, and her lips didn't move, but that's what she said. And so we both looked back at the object, and it tilted slightly downward. At this angle, it appeared to be spinning as a flash of iridescent lights made one complete rotation around its exterior, and then in a split second, it shot straight up and disappeared into the night sky. And so darkness resumed along with all the sounds of the night and the crisp chill of the air. I stood dumbfounded, amazed, and terrified by what I just experienced, while at the same time I felt relief that it was over and excited. I didn't know about whether to run away or cry and laugh. And so I looked over at my sister, wanting to run to her but still frozen to the place I stood, as if all of my cognitive resources were occupied trying to process everything, and I was momentarily unable to communicate movement to my legs. Penny was clearly not frightened by what we had just witnessed. She seemed just as blissful as I'd ever seen her, and while at times I found that refreshing, in this instant it confused me. I needed to observe a regular adult response. And so reclaiming the use of my legs, I ran towards the door, saying, "Let's go tell Mom." Penny agreed and followed me through the back door. I was glad she was there and had my back. I knew there was no way my mom would believe just me about a spaceship if it was only me telling it, running in with my Kmart telescope. And so we entered the dining room where Mom stood laughing and my grandma sang the phrase, "We won't go until we get some." And I claimed that Mom, me and my Penny just saw and so I left it there because I briefly forgot what my sister had called it, but she chimed in to assist. "A UFO," she said. And so my mom asked if we did with my new telescope, and we said no, it was out in the backyard by my fort right above the fence. And so I wanted to tell her everything all at once, but it just wasn't fast enough or articulate enough to express what all that had transpired. And my mom was a regular adult who saw me as an imaginative child, and my sister as well. And so she was almost like a somewhat mild version of the crazy person she expected to show by the end of the night. Maybe it was Santa. I hope he doesn't pass you up before you're in bed, she said. And so I didn't believe in Santa Claus. I never did. I just pretended for as long as I could for the extra presents. I did understand the situation I was in, though. I knew Mom was done for the night and wanted me to go to bed so she could set up the Santa gifts and finally get some rest herself. Not to mention she was usually well within the bounds of good insight by steering away from conversations featuring supernatural events with my sister. And so it just so happened that on this occasion it was all true, and I understood that she would never know that. Shortly after that, a movie came out called Fire in the Sky, starring D.B. Sweeney, based on true events about a small-town man who was allegedly abducted by aliens, experimented on, and then returned several days later. This movie, coupled with my memory of that event, terrified me beyond expression, causing me to have night terrors throughout my childhood about the visitors returning to claim me, and I'm certain it initiated my lifelong battle with sleep paralysis dreams. I was so terrified I wouldn't watch or read anything that had to do with extraterrestrials, and I wouldn't speak of it again for nearly 30 years. Somewhere in that span of time, I convinced myself that the entire event had been a terrible nightmare that I happened to just remember just one single detail of, down to the mittens I was wearing, where they landed on the ground, where I took them off, and so the rush of heat I felt, and so on my cheeks, and then when I ran back into the house that night. My sister was estranged for many years throughout my childhood, as her condition got much worse before it began to get better. She finally got clean and got on the right meds, and a few years ago she came to live with us. The first week she was here, we spent a lot of time talking about different things that had happened over the years, things she said and done. I discovered that she had barely any recollection of a great deal of it, claiming that that must have been the other me. I guess I caught up in the spirit of sharing, or I got brave or something, but decided to ask her about that night during one of our talks. And so I asked, "Do you remember that one Christmas Eve?" Is all I could get out of the mouth before she responded, "Oh, you mean the night we saw the UFO in the backyard? Yeah, that's a memory that stuck. I remember it as clear as yesterday." She then proceeded to describe the experience from her perspective with very little variation from my own experience. So there it is. It was not a dream. It was not my 9-year-old imagination. All those little details that made no sense, the ones I used to tell myself it didn't happen, are the same details that later on did, affirmed the reality of it. I saw a UFO in my backyard on Christmas Eve, 1988, and I was 9 years old. And that's it. That's everything that this user, Audacious Boo, mentioned in their long but detailed entry. So let's go ahead and let's talk about that here. For starters, isn't that interesting that this happened day before Christmas, right? Probably one of the least days you could expect something like this to occur. And obviously this was happening during a big family get-together, sharing gifts, opening gifts, about to wrap up for the night. And in her case, it was that fateful telescope gift, even though it was a cheap one. I'm sure it was a nice one though too, $14.99 priced one, that they decided to just use for a few minutes out there in the backyard area. Imagine if they hadn't had done that. Imagine if they hadn't had gotten that telescope gift. What a difference that night would have made, no? And so there they were out there. I can attest to what they were stating, what the user was stating about ice and snow and so on when it comes to Texas. It does come every now and then, and when that happens, it's almost like one big storm, and then it's just ending afterward. Like the next morning, it's almost melting. And so her seeing like frozen icicles and then the water bowl frozen and so on does make sense. And there she was playing with it, trying to get something in terms of a rare occurrence on the icicle, when as it turns out they saw an even rarer occurrence. What about that UFO, if you could even call it that? Was it a part of the UFO? Was it an orb? Was it something else? Clearly it was much smaller The way she described it about being the size of almost like a canoe, if you could even call it that. Clearly nothing large like a UFO, almost like if it was either self-manned, like if it was, in other words, run by its own machinery, or if there was someone in there, something, some alien that was just much smaller, but there it was right in front of them. It was clearly observing them just as they were observing it. The most interesting part, though, was this. The fact that time almost seemed to slow down. Remember that part when she was stating that the water droplets were suddenly now taking longer to get to the ground, not because they were dripping in slower variations, but because they were still dripping, but the length, the time it took from the water droplet to fall to the ground was now stretching longer. Was this part of the UFO, whatever that was? Did it cause time to slow down around them? Imagine the implications of something like that, right? And then also the idea that they could hear nothing. It caused the entire surrounding area around them to be almost like a vacuum, and there was nothing to be heard. And there's even that brief, almost scary moment where it was causing them to read their own minds. The user mentioned that that heard Penny state something about it being a UFO, but she never saw her lips move, and she never heard her voice come out from her mouth. It was almost as if it was telepathic. So was this thing causing it as well? Interesting stuff, no? Very brief encounter, too. She mentioned it was less than a minute. There it was observing them, and then all of a sudden it tilted downward. The way it looked, too, it was just like pure chrome, but shining millions of points of light. Self-illumination, too. Nothing discernible about it having like any outward lights. It was just almost like coming from inside its own surface, if you could even call it that. And then boom, just like that, it was gone. It was shooting straight upwards, and it was gone into the night sky. Whatever it was doing, it had observed them long enough to be able to gather what it needed, and then it was gone. And so immediately they ran inside, but of course it was just another idea of of imaginative child, something like that the mother was quickly dismissing, and then they were off to bed. But clearly this caused a lifelong change in this person. Sleep paralysis, having those type of nightmares, in other words, and then having those type of experiences later on, paranoid experiences, thinking, especially after that movie Fire in the Sky, that something else could happen to her. This is the kind of moment, again, where I was mentioning a minute ago. Imagine if they just didn't take that telescope outside, what a difference that would have made in her life. But the fact, again, that the sister recalled it later on goes in picture perfect accuracy, goes to show again that it really did happen. Both of them encountered it, both of them were witnesses, and then even after all these years, they still both recall it to the T. So interesting stuff. But if anybody has any more info, anything else I might have missed, then please post those comments below. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.